The boardroom was silent enough to hear the hum of the overhead lights when I spoke the words that would end my career. I'd like to request a $2 raise. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't grand. It was a simple plea, less than the cost of a coffee. But the moment it left my mouth, Graham Solberg, our CEO, leaned back in his chair and let out a laugh that burned through the room. $2? He said, shaking his head as if I had committed a crime against ambition itself. That's your grand demand? Heart, you've been here too long. Small-minded requests like that are exactly why this company needs new energy. Before I take you deeper into what happened next, let me pause here for just a moment. Take a deep breath. Stretch your shoulders. Sometimes even the smallest act of caring for yourself can make all the difference after a long day. Tell me where you're watching from. Tap like and subscribe if you've ever felt invisible in the very place you were supposed to belong. Now, let's go back to my cruel moment. The humiliation was sharp, cutting deeper than I expected. For 14 years, I had worked as the corporate communications archivist, the person responsible for every contract, every press release, every footnote that carried the company's name. My fingerprints were on documents worth millions, even billions. I was the invisible backbone, the one who made sure the company never stumbled over details. And yet, in that moment, Graham reduced me to nothing more than a punchline. The contrast could not have been starker. I was a woman in my 40s with quiet habits, the kind of employee who stayed late to proof legal clauses no one else wanted to touch. Across the table, watching the scene unfold, sat Ethan Solberg, Graham's 27-year-old nephew. Designer suit, sharp haircut, smug grin. He had spent more time curating his Instagram feed than understanding the records I managed. I knew what was coming even before Graham spoke the words, but they still struck like a blow. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to introduce our new Vice President of Strategy. Ethan Solberg will be leading us into the future. The room erupted into polite applause, the sound ringing in my ears as I sat frozen. In one breath, my modest request was turned into evidence of obsolescence. In the next, Ethan's nepotistic promotion was framed as a triumph. I felt the weight of the injustice press down on me. I wasn't just denied a raise. I was erased, humiliated in public, discarded so a family heir could be crowned. And the worst part? Everyone saw it, and no one dared to object. I walked out of that boardroom with the sting of humiliation still pressing on my chest. But betrayal carries a deeper wound. It doesn't burn fast. It settles like ice, spreading slowly, numbing everything you once believed in. For 14 years, I was the invisible hand guiding the company's every word. My official title, Corporate Communications Archivist, sounded plain enough. But in reality, I was the keeper of its memory. Contracts, press releases, investor agreements, internal reports. If it bore the company's name, it crossed my desk. I knew where every document lived, where every clause was tucked away, and which signatures mattered most. My colleagues joked that I had a second brain made of filing cabinets, but I wore that like armor. Being invisible didn't bother me. What mattered was that my work kept the company standing tall. What did bother me, though, was remembering what that invisibility had cost. There was the winter my mother had been scheduled for a cardiology checkup. The appointment was weeks overdue, and she had been coughing more than usual. The night before, Graham's office sent me a frantic request, a last-minute addendum to a supplier contract that had to be filed before midnight. I looked at the clock, then at my mother's medical file resting on my kitchen counter. I canceled her appointment, called to reschedule for the following month, and stayed in the office until 2 a.m, combing through clauses no one would ever thank me for. That wasn't the only time. I skipped birthdays, anniversaries, even funerals, all because loyalty had been drilled into me as the company's lifeblood. I told myself the sacrifices were temporary, that they would be recognized one day. But sitting in my car after the boardroom spectacle, I knew better. Loyalty had been a one-way street. The sharpest sting came from a memory that surfaced uninvited. Ethan, Graham's nephew, standing beside me just a few weeks earlier. He had come into my office with that careless grin, notebook in hand. "Uncle Graham wants me to learn the ropes," he'd said, half apologetic, half proud. I assumed it was harmless, shadowing, observing, the kind of corporate grooming exercise that never lasted more than a few days. So I explained everything. I walked him through the system, showed him how the validation pipeline worked, pointed out the quirks of our document indexing. I even let him handle a low-risk file to practice. He was polite, attentive, even grateful. I thought I was helping a young man learn discipline in an industry that eats its rookies alive. Now the betrayal pulsed hot in my memory. I hadn't been training a curious intern. I had been training my replacement. That realization made my stomach turn. Every smile, every thank you, every scribbled note in Ethan's leather-bound notebook. They weren't signs of respect. They were rehearsals for the performance he would give when I was pushed aside. And Graham had orchestrated it all, using my own trust and diligence as the weapon to cut me loose. Betrayal doesn't scream. It whispers. It whispers that all your sacrifices were meaningless, that your mother's delayed checkups, your empty birthdays, your tired eyes at midnight, none of it mattered. You thought you were indispensable, but you were nothing more than a bridge for someone else to cross. As I sat in the quiet of my car, hands trembling against the steering wheel, the weight of 14 years pressed down on me, I wasn't just humiliated. I wasn't just overlooked. I had been betrayed in the cruelest way possible, by being used to perfect the skills of the very man who would take my place. And deep inside, a voice I hadn't heard in years began to stir, a voice that said, betrayal doesn't have to end with silence. The meeting ended without applause. No one spoke as Graham Solberg announced my termination. Only the shuffle of papers and the soft clearing of throats. By the time I stood, the security guard was already waiting near the door. His presence wasn't hostile, but it was firm, the kind of silent instruction that told me resistance would only make things worse. I gathered my notebook, the same one I had carried for years, its corners worn soft from late nights of scribbling edits. My pen slipped into the spiral binding. My hands didn't shake. They stayed unnervingly steady, as though my body had decided I could not afford even the luxury of trembling. The guard fell in step beside me as I walked down the long corridor toward the elevators. It felt like the longest hallway I had ever crossed, lined with familiar faces who suddenly found the floor fascinating. Not one pair of eyes lifted to meet mine. I understood. Fear is contagious in a place like this. If they acknowledged me, they risked being next. So they stared at screens, at coffee cups, at anything that wasn't me. My footsteps echoed, sharp and lonely, like punctuation marks no one wanted to read. That silence cut deeper than Graham's laughter in the boardroom. It said, "You are already gone. We cannot afford to remember you." Then, just as I passed the row of analyst desks, a small movement caught my eye. Julia, the junior analyst with oversized glasses and a nervous way of tucking her hair behind her ear, stood up quickly. She didn't speak. Instead, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand, so discreetly the guard didn't even notice. I felt the warmth of her palm for a fraction of a second before she pulled away. My throat tightened. I wanted to thank her, but words would have cracked my restraint wide open. As the elevator doors closed, I unfolded the paper with one hand, shielding it from view. 3 short sentences stared back at me, scrawled in hurried ink. "Check the Stratacore files. They didn't clear everything." My pulse hammered. Stratacore. The name had been circling the office like a buzzword for months. The $640 million merger everyone was banking on. I had been in charge of cataloging early drafts, making sure every disclosure was properly filed, every clause cross-checked. If Julia said something was left behind, she meant it. But standing there in the elevator, pressed between the guard and my own humiliation, I couldn't let the words take root, not yet. My shame was too raw. The memory of Graham's mocking voice, the sound of my colleague's silence, the clapping for Ethan, it all pressed against my chest like iron. So I folded the paper again, carefully, as though it were fragile. Without a word, I slid it into the pocket of my blazer. My face didn't change. My posture didn't falter. I pretended it was nothing more than a receipt. A scrap I would forget. The elevator reached the lobby. The guard nodded me toward the exit. I walked past the receptionist, past the glass doors that had opened for me every morning for 14 years. They closed behind me with a heavy click. On the street outside, I let the cool air hit my face. My body ached to cry, to scream, to collapse. But I didn't. Suppression was the only armor I had left. So I straightened my shoulders, clutched the folded paper in my pocket, and walked away in silence, knowing the words inside it might matter, but too ashamed to believe they could matter for me. The house was quiet when I returned, but it was the wrong kind of quiet. Not the restful silence after a long day, but the heavy hush of a place weighed down by unspoken burdens. I set my bag down on the dining table, careful not to disturb the stack of unopened envelopes waiting there. Each one carried its own demand: utility bills, overdue notices, reminders from the pharmacy about my mother's prescriptions still sitting behind the counter. I walked past them and into my home office, though calling it an office was generous. It was a cramped room with peeling paint, an aging desk that wobbled when I leaned on it, and a single lamp that buzzed faintly whenever I switched it on. The chair creaked as I lowered myself into it, the sound startling in the otherwise still air. Isolation pressed in from all sides. At the company, I had been overlooked, invisible by design. At home, I was invisible in a different way, not seen by anyone at all. 14 years of service, and now I sat in a space that felt more like exile than refuge. I stared at the bills again, the harsh black print shouting due dates I couldn't ignore. My mother's prescriptions weighed heavier than the rest. She needed those pills, but I had put them off, telling myself I'd pick them up after payday. Payday, however, was now a question mark. I felt the bitter irony twist in my stomach. $2 more an hour might have covered them, and instead, asking for it had cost me everything. The desk still held my old laptop, a loyal companion through countless late nights of cataloging, proofing, and double-checking company records. I powered it on, partly out of habit, partly to distract myself from the growing ache in my chest. Folders bloomed across the screen, years of work neatly labeled and archived. They were ghosts now, records of a life I had given away piece by piece. I clicked into one of the old directories, not expecting much, just muscle memory guiding me through names and dates. My eyes skimmed over familiar files until one line stopped me cold. Pending adjustment. Heart. $2 hourly wage increase. The words blinked back at me, sitting there like a quiet accusation. It was a note I had left for myself months earlier. A harmless annotation buried inside a draft contract. I had flagged it as a reminder, something to nudge HR later. I must have forgotten to delete it. Now here it was, still alive inside the system, a small digital echo of my plea. My breath caught. My first instinct was embarrassment. How careless I must have been to leave such a personal request inside a professional document. But then another thought crept in, one that made my pulse quicken. That contract wasn't just any document. It was tied to the Stratacore merger files. And if my note remained there, unresolved, it could still be sitting inside the pipeline they were racing toward completion. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen, the glow painting my face in pale light. For a moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The irony was too sharp. I had been cast out for asking for a raise so small it seemed laughable. Yet my forgotten annotation might still be tethered to the deal they valued at $640 million. The thought lingered. But shame was still stronger than hope. I closed the file quickly, almost as if the words might burn me. I folded into myself, clutching my arms, and reminded myself that I was no longer part of that world. Isolation wasn't just a circumstance now. It was the only place I was allowed to exist. The morning after I discovered the forgotten annotation, I woke to the kind of headlines that made my stomach turn. Ethan Solberg's face was everywhere, on LinkedIn banners, company newsletters, even tech blogs that had never once cared about our work before. He had posted a glossy photo of himself in a tailored navy suit, leaning confidently against the company's logo wall. The caption read, "Honored to be the youngest vice president to lead a $640 million merger. The future is bright." Bright. The word sliced at me. My own future had been dismissed as small and obsolete for the price of $2, while his was being painted as limitless. Commenters flooded in, calling him visionary, bold, the perfect heir to his uncle's empire. I wanted to type something, anything, but my fingers froze above the keyboard. Even in exile, I felt the invisible hand of the company press down on me. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. Resentment filled the silence that had once been numbness. I thought of every late night I had spent in that building, every detail I had guarded so carefully, while Ethan had been nowhere near a desk. The company called him the future, but it was my past, the 14 years I had sacrificed, that built the foundation he was now strutting across. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Julia. "Don't believe the hype. His brag doesn't match the files. He's parading like the merger is ready, but he's holding unfinished drafts. Be careful, he doesn't know what's in them." I read the words twice, a hot pulse rising in my chest. Julia had no reason to reach out, no incentive to risk herself. And yet she had. Her quiet courage fanned the flame of my anger. Ethan wasn't just arrogant, he was careless. And carelessness in the world I had lived in wasn't harmless, it was dangerous. I clicked back onto Ethan's post, scanning every smug detail. That was when I saw it. A screenshot he had attached, meant to show off the precision of his leadership. In the corner of the image, nearly invisible, was a sliver of a metadata panel. My breath stopped. There it was. My name. Hart. Pending adjustment. $2 hourly wage increase. He had uploaded proof of his own incompetence, parading my annotation like a trophy without realizing it. A trace of me, hidden in the fabric of the files, had slipped past him and into public view. The sight jolted me. My resentment sharpened into something steadier, colder. It wasn't just that Ethan had stolen my place. It wasn't just that Graham had humiliated me. It was that they had done all this while standing on the very work I had built, blind to the details that gave it structure. They celebrated him while carrying me inside their triumph, like a ghost they couldn't exorcise. For a moment, I considered commenting on his post, exposing it right there in the open. The temptation to strike back was raw, almost overwhelming, but I stopped myself. Not yet. Fury is fire, but fire without aim only burns the one holding it. I set the phone down and forced my breath steady. The resentment would stay with me. Yes, but now it had direction. Julia's warning wasn't just kindness, it was confirmation. Ethan's empire was built on unfinished foundations. And my forgotten note was more than an accident. It was a fracture line. They thought I was gone. They thought I was erased. But my name was still in the system, still under their spotlight, glowing faintly where they least expected it. And the deeper their arrogance grew, the sweeter the silence of my revenge would taste. The news broke on a Thursday morning. Graham Solberg was accelerating the merger with Stratacore. No more waiting for extended audits. No more compliance checks. Efficiency is the future, the press release declared. Though I knew the truth, it wasn't efficiency. It was desperation disguised as vision. Graham wanted his nephew on the headlines, not the sidelines. I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through updates on my phone. There were photos of Ethan shaking hands with executives twice his age, his smile wide and rehearsed. Analysts called him bold, decisive, a fresh face unafraid to move fast. I nearly laughed. Boldness wasn't skipping the guardrails. It was ignoring the cliff ahead. Still, disbelief tightened around my chest. What if they had already found my note? What if Graham's team, with all their resources, had uncovered my annotation and erased it before it mattered? My heart raced as the thought played out. My name deleted, my warning buried, and my humiliation complete. For a flicker of a moment, the fear was so real I could taste it. Maybe the system I had built wasn't as foolproof as I remembered. Maybe they had found a way to override it, to silence me even in absence. The idea hollowed me out. To be cast aside was one thing. To be erased completely was another. I closed my eyes and tried to steady myself. 14 years of work. And I couldn't even be sure of the one safeguard I thought I had left. The disbelief cut deeper than anger. It whispered that I might have imagined my power entirely, that perhaps, after everything, I was nothing more than a ghost watching the living march on without me. But then memory returned, sharp and insistent. I hadn't just designed the pipeline. I had written its bones. And in its bones, I had hidden a rule. Unresolved annotations could not be removed or bypassed. They didn't just vanish when someone pressed delete. They required the original author's digital signature, a mark only I carried. The memory hit like sunlight piercing through heavy clouds. I could almost see the lines of code again. The late nights I had spent crafting that safeguard, not for myself, but for the integrity of the company. Every compliance officer had praised the system as unshakable. Even Graham had once called it Hart's unnecessary obsession with details. That obsession was now my shield. Relief came slowly, not as a rush, but as a steadying warmth. They couldn't erase me, not Graham, not Ethan, not any lawyer on his payroll. As long as that annotation lived unresolved, it lived under my name. The merger could race forward. Contracts could be dressed up in champagne and speeches. But my $2 note was an anchor they couldn't cut loose. I opened my laptop and pulled up a draft I still had access to from home, one of the older versions. There it was. The phrase glowing on the screen like a quiet rebellion. Pending adjustment. Hart, 2 hourly wage increase. No one but me could touch it. I leaned back, exhaling for what felt like the first time in days. The disbelief hadn't vanished entirely. Some part of me still struggled to accept that the system I built could outlast the empire that mocked me. But for the first time since that boardroom humiliation, I felt the ground under my feet again. They thought they had buried me. Instead, they were standing on my foundation, blind to the trap built into its stones. The morning of the ceremony, I brewed coffee the way I always did. 2 scoops, boiling water, no cream. Routine was all I had left to steady myself. My laptop sat open on the kitchen table. Waiting, I knew I shouldn't watch, that it would only sharpen the wound. But bitterness has a way of pulling you toward the very thing you fear. The live stream opened with a gleaming stage in a downtown hotel ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung above, casting golden light on the polished tables below. A string quartet played softly as executives in tailored suits found their seats. It looked less like a business agreement and more like a coronation. And perhaps it was. Graham Solberg strode onto the stage first, shoulders back, his voice booming with the arrogance of a man convinced the world bent to his will. "Today marks a flawless future," he declared, his tone dripping with triumph. "This merger will solidify our dominance, ensure our legacy, and showcase the bold leadership of a new generation." The camera panned, and there he was, Ethan, my supposed shadow, now basking in a spotlight that had never been mine. His smile was wide, rehearsed, and shameless. The caption beneath his image on the livestream read, "Ethan Solberg, Vice President of Strategy, Lead Architect of Success." Architect. The word struck me like a slap. I had been the one drafting, cataloging, cross-checking, ensuring every dotted line was in its place. Ethan had inherited my work, dressed it up with expensive cologne and a practiced handshake, and now the world was calling him the builder. Applause thundered through the ballroom. Glasses of champagne were lifted high, catching the light in golden bursts. Graham raised his flute toward Ethan, declaring him the architect of success. The crowd roared approval. The cameras captured every angle. And for a moment, even I felt the weight of inevitability. This was how it always went. Power chose its heirs, and the rest of us faded into footnotes. I clenched my mug tighter, the bitterness curling inside me. Watching Ethan soak in praise for work he barely understood was agony. But beneath the resentment lay a darker anticipation. I knew what file lived inside their system. I knew what annotation they had failed to clear. And yet part of me doubted. Part of me feared I had remembered wrong, that my safeguard had somehow slipped, that this ceremony would close without a hitch, and I would be left with nothing but humiliation. The master of ceremonies called for the contract upload. A technician stepped forward, inserting a sleek drive into the projector system. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the screen behind Graham lit up, displaying the merger pipeline. My breath caught. The file name was there, glowing in bold letters across the giant screen. The exact draft I had touched, the one that carried my annotation. For a split second, I wondered if anyone else could see what I saw. To the audience, it was just a string of numbers and dates. But to me, it was a beacon. That file carried my handwriting in its bones. My fingers hovered above the keyboard of my laptop. Though there was nothing for me to type, nothing for me to trigger, the system would act on its own. That was the cruel beauty of it. I could only watch, suspended between dread and grim satisfaction. As the stage was set for their triumph, or their collapse, the bitterness welled in me, sharper now, edged with anticipation so strong it felt like a physical ache. I had been erased, humiliated, betrayed, but my name was still alive in that file. And as the progress bar began to crawl across the giant screen, I leaned closer to my laptop, my heart pounding, waiting for the moment when illusion would collide with reality. The ballroom hushed as the contract upload began. A progress bar crept across the massive projector screen. Each percentage ticked like a countdown to certainty. Ethan adjusted his tie, his grin widening with every passing second, while Graham lifted his glass again, ready to seal his own legacy with words as polished as the chandeliers above him. Then, without warning, the screen froze. The progress bar stopped at 83%. A sharp tone echoed through the speakers, drawing frowns across the audience. The technician bent closer to the laptop, tapping furiously, but the projector did not obey. Instead, a black error box appeared, stark against the white backdrop of celebration. In bold letters, visible to every executive, journalist, and guest in the room, the message burned across the screen. File invalid, pending adjustment, heart, 2 hourly wage increase. For a heartbeat, silence held. It wasn't the respectful kind. It was suffocating, stunned. The silence of a room punched in the chest. Ethan's smile collapsed, his eyes darting wildly between the technician and his uncle. Graham's face drained of color, his jaw slack as though he had been struck. Glasses hovered midair. Applause forgotten. Champagne fizzing unattended at the rims. The string quartet faltered and stopped altogether. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters craned forward, pens scratching frantically across notepads. The words stayed on screen, merciless and immovable. My name was there, in bold, heart. I sat in my kitchen, coffee cooling beside me, watching it unfold on my laptop with a stillness that felt unnatural. Inside, my pulse raced, but outside, I was steady. This was no accident. This was the safeguard doing exactly what it had been designed to do: refuse validation unless every annotation had been resolved by its author. The irony was brutal. For years, Graham had called my obsession with details unnecessary, a waste of company time. Now those very details were detonating his empire, live in front of hundreds of witnesses and thousands more streaming online. Ethan leaned toward the microphone, stammering, It's a glitch. Just a glitch. But his voice cracked. The technician shook his head, whispering something that carried through the microphone. It requires the original author's sign-off. We can't bypass it. The room erupted. Stratacor's lead counsel stood abruptly, demanding an explanation. Investors muttered among themselves. Reporters shouted over one another, the illusion of control crumbling in real time. And there it was. My name, glowing in bold, not erased, not silenced, displayed larger than it had ever been while I worked there. Larger than any recognition Graham had ever offered me. The humiliation he thought he delivered in that boardroom was nothing compared to the humiliation now unraveling him in front of the world. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. Cold control was the only armor I had left, and I wore it carefully. Let them scramble. Let them sweat. The safeguard was beyond their reach. My part was already done. Ethan tried again, his voice higher, almost pleading. We'll fix this. Just a moment? But the words sounded childish against the unyielding error. Graham slammed a hand against the podium. His composure shattered, barking at staff who had no answers to give. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms, the hum of the old lamp filling the silence of my office. For once. Silence wasn't isolation. It was power. The company had discarded me as invisible, but invisibility had become my weapon. On the screen, the error remained unmoved. File invalid. Pending adjustment. Heart. $2 hourly wage increase. Their empire was unraveling over the very thing they mocked me for, and I didn't have to lift a finger. The error message stayed frozen on the projector. Unblinking. Merciless. The ballroom, moments earlier a theater of celebration, had become a pit of confusion. Murmurs swelled into shouts, chairs scraped against marble floors. And the champagne that had been lifted moments ago sat abandoned, bubbles rising quietly as if mocking the chaos. Stratacor's lead counsel stood first. Her voice was sharp, commanding, "What is this? Why is an employee annotation appearing in a final merger contract?" She pointed directly at Graham, who blustered. His face blotched red. "It's nothing, a technical glitch," he insisted, waving his hand as though that might erase the words glowing 20 feet tall behind him. "Our IT team will fix it immediately." But the technician at the laptop only shook his head, sweat rolling down his temple. He typed furiously, tried command after command, but the error message blinked back. Unyielding. "It's locked," he whispered, though the microphone caught the words and sent them echoing across the ballroom. "What do you mean, locked?" Stratacor's CEO snapped, his polished composure cracking. "This is a $640 million agreement. You will explain this. Now!" The room buzzed with reporters scribbling, phones recording. whispers slicing through the air like knives. Graham spun on his heels, storming toward the IT team. "Fix it!" he barked, voice cracking into rage. "Delete the annotation! Wipe it! Do whatever you need to do!" The technician swallowed hard. "Sir, it's tied to the author's digital signature. We can't override it, not without her biometric ID." The ballroom stilled again, but this time with dread. Her. Me. My name, still glowing in bold on the screen, was no longer just an embarrassing footnote. It was the unmovable wall between them and their triumph. In my small kitchen, I sipped cold coffee, the bitter taste steadying me. On my laptop, the live stream stuttered under the weight of chaos, cameras zooming on Graham's furious face, Ethan's pale expression, Stratacor's CEO leaning forward with venom in his voice. The panic was almost palpable through the screen, yet I sat untouched, watching from a distance like someone observing a storm from behind thick glass. Ethan leaned toward Graham, his voice audible through the mic. "Can't we just sign another draft? Start fresh?" The technician shook his head again. "Every version runs through the same validation system. The annotation's unresolved. It follows the file until the author clears it." "The author is gone!" Graham roared, slamming his hand against the podium. "She's nothing! She has no authority here." But the truth hung heavy in the air. I had more authority in absence than Ethan did in his celebrated presence. Stratacor's CEO stood, jaw tight. "We will not proceed until this is resolved. This is a breach of compliance and a humiliation to my board. Explain how a $2 wage note is still embedded in a multi-million-dollar contract." His words cut deeper than any knife. Graham stammered, gestured wildly. But his audience wasn't listening anymore. Investors shifted in their seats, whispers rising to anger. Reporters held their cameras steady, capturing every ounce of panic spilling across the once confident stage. And still, the screen did not change. My annotation sat there like a monument to everything they had ignored. Pending adjustment. Heart. 2 hourly wage increase. I leaned back in my chair, calm settling over me like a heavy blanket. For years, I had been the invisible one, the woman in the corner of the office whose details no one valued. Now, the details had become immovable, louder than any speech Graham could muster. The frenzy on screen only deepened. Ethan tugged at his tie, muttering excuses into the ears of nearby executives. Graham cursed, shouting orders to pull the plug, to restart the system. The IT staff tried both, but every reboot landed on the same locked error, the same name. Mine. I pressed my palm against the pocket of my blazer where Julia's folded notes still lived, as if to remind myself that this wasn't a dream. Panic belonged to them now. Calm belonged to me. For the first time since that humiliating boardroom, I wasn't invisible. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to fight. My name was enough. My silence was enough. And as the camera captured Graham's face, twisted with fury, and Stratacor's CEO storming toward the exit, I exhaled slowly, knowing the unraveling had only just begun. By dawn the next morning, the headlines had already spread across every financial outlet, each one more brutal than the last. $2 wage dispute derails $640 merger. Solberg Empire stumbles over pay note. World's most expensive annotation. The story wasn't confined to business pages. It bled into morning talk shows, social media feeds, late-night comedy monologues, and everywhere. One image recurred: Ethan's smile, caught in the precise moment before it crumbled. The clip looped endlessly online, showing his confident grin melting into confusion as my annotation appeared on the screen behind him. Millions watched it, replayed it, mocked it. What had been his coronation had become his humiliation. I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through articles on my laptop. Each headline felt like a balm poured over wounds I hadn't realized were still bleeding. For 14 years. I had been the invisible hand holding contracts together, unseen and unacknowledged. Now, invisibility was impossible. My name was everywhere, tied not to scandal, but to the truth. The vindication wasn't loud. It didn't come as shouts or cheers. It simmered, slow and steady, warming me from the inside. I hadn't needed to fight back in that boardroom. I hadn't needed to scream or beg. The work itself had spoken, louder and clearer than I ever could. Social media latched onto the irony. Memes spread with captions like, "Should have given her the $2," and "the most expensive raise in history." Hashtags trended. Journalists dug deeper, pulling up past quotes where Graham had dismissed detail-oriented work as tedious. Now those same details were undoing him in public. Still, I didn't gloat. I couldn't. Vindication is different from revenge. It isn't about shouting. It's about the quiet proof that you were right all along. And as much as the headlines thrilled me, what touched me most was what came next. My inbox pinged. A new message appeared from Julia. "The office is chaos. Reporters keep calling. People are whispering in corners. But I wanted you to know, everyone finally sees what you carried alone. They're realizing how much of this place lived on your shoulders." I read it 3 times, my throat tightening with something I hadn't felt in months. Recognition. Julia hadn't said much when she slipped me that note, hadn't dared to meet my eyes as I was escorted out, but her words now pierced through the noise of headlines and memes. They reminded me that vindication wasn't just for the public. It was for the quiet truth inside the office, too. For years, my contributions had been a ghost story in that building, whispered but never acknowledged. Now, with a single annotation, the ghost had taken center stage. My name, once forgotten, had forced itself into the narrative, and no one, not Graham, not Ethan, not any polished press release, could erase it. I leaned back in my chair, letting the glow of the laptop screen wash over me. Outside, the city stirred awake, unaware that a $2 request had toppled an empire's image overnight. Inside, I sat with a strange calm. The simmering vindication wasn't about fame, or even justice in the grand sense. It was about being seen, about knowing that the sacrifices, the late nights, the canceled doctor's appointments for my mother, the birthdays missed, hadn't been wasted in silence, for once. The silence was broken, and as I closed Julia's email, I realized that vindication is not the same as closure, but it is the first step toward it. The empire that mocked me had collapsed on the very detail they dismissed. The world was laughing at them now, and I, finally, could breathe. By the end of the week, the Solberg Empire looked nothing like the glittering stage I had seen during the merger ceremony. The headlines that once celebrated their boldness now tracked their unraveling in real time. Investors, spooked by the public spectacle, began pulling out one after another. Shares tumbled, analysts downgraded forecasts, and whispers of a board revolt leaked into the press. But the sharpest blow came from Stratacore itself. In a statement issued Friday morning, they announced their withdrawal from the merger. The words were simple but devastating. "We cannot move forward with a partner whose compliance standards jeopardize shareholder trust." No amount of spin could disguise what had happened. The $640 million deal was dead. Watching it unfold, I felt a strange sensation inside me, like a tight cord that had been pulling at my chest for years was finally beginning to loosen. It wasn't gone yet. Not fully. But every article, every analyst's report, every disappointed shareholder's statement cut through the cord a little more. I could feel release building, slow and steady, with each unraveling thread. Graham, of course, tried to salvage what he could. He called press conferences, pounding his fists on the podium, declaring it all a technical malfunction. He barked about glitches, about sabotage, about rogue code. But the public wasn't listening anymore. You can't call something a glitch when the world has seen a name, my name, projected 20 feet tall for the cameras to capture. And then, as if the humiliation weren't enough, the internet delivered the final spark. Old social media posts from Ethan surfaced, screenshots pulled from accounts he had thought long deleted. In one, he mocked employees who beg for pennies, with a smirking emoji. In another, he wrote, "If people want more money, maybe they should work harder instead of whining." The timing was catastrophic. These posts spread like wildfire, landing in the hands of reporters already circling the scandal. The narrative shifted instantly. It wasn't just about a merger derailed by a $2 annotation. It was about arrogance, entitlement, and contempt for the very workers who had built the company. The public's fury rose like a tidal wave. Comment sections brimmed with stories from former employees, recounting their own humiliations under the Solbergs. Hashtags trended again, $2 empire and begging for pennies. Even late-night hosts took aim, flashing Ethan's old posts on screen while audiences laughed and jeered. From my kitchen table, I read the posts over and over, each one like a shard of truth finally exposed. For years, I had carried the weight of sacrifice in silence, missing appointments for my mother, skipping milestones, bearing my own needs for the sake of loyalty. And yet, men like Ethan had stood on our shoulders, mocking us as they climbed. Now the world was seeing it. The mask had slipped. And it wasn't just me who felt vindicated this time. It was every invisible worker who had ever been dismissed as small, insignificant, replaceable. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. The tightness in my chest loosened further. The release wasn't complete yet, but it was building, moment by moment, as their empire crumbled under the weight of their own arrogance. News anchors spoke of shareholder lawsuits, of federal investigations into compliance failures, of a family dynasty in free fall. Graham's voice grew hoarse in televised denials. Ethan vanished from the public eye altogether, his accounts locked, his face suddenly absent from the feeds that once adored him. And me? I didn't need to speak a word. My silence had already spoken louder than their noise. The release was not just personal, it was collective. People I would never meet, employees in cities I had never visited, were nodding, sharing, remembering their own battles with leaders who had treated them as expendable. My name had become a symbol, not of victimhood, but of what happens when the smallest request is ignored and the smallest detail is underestimated. I knew the cord wasn't entirely severed yet. There was still a final step, a closing moment where liberation would arrive in full. But as I sat in that small office, the glow of my laptop painting the room, I felt it, the slow building of freedom, the tide rising against the empire that had once buried me. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe they were not untouchable. They never had been. The phone call from Stratacore came 2 days after the headlines had reached their loudest peak. The woman on the other end spoke with the kind of clipped efficiency that only comes from high-stakes corporate crises. Ms. Hart, this is Evelyn Rhodes, Chief Operating Officer at Stratacore. We've reviewed your role in the recent events. We would like to invite you to serve as an independent consultant for our Compliance and Records Division. I sat very still, the receiver pressed to my ear. For a moment, disbelief hovered. After years of invisibility, after being marched out under the watchful eyes of colleagues too afraid to meet my gaze, I was being asked back into the very space I had been cast from. But this time, it wasn't as a servant of someone else's empire. It was on my terms. "I will consider your offer," I said finally, my voice calm, measured. I didn't need to rush, didn't need to sound eager. Dignity, once stripped from me in that boardroom, was now mine to wield again. When I hung up, the house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I carried my coffee to the small desk in my office, the same one where bills still lay stacked, where my mother's prescriptions still waited. But something in the room felt different now. Lighter. The silence was no longer exile. It was choice. I opened my laptop. The news ticker scrolled relentlessly across the screen. Solberg faces shareholder revolt. $640 million merger dead. Below it, analysts debated whether Graham would survive as CEO, whether Ethan would ever return to public view. The empire that had laughed at my $2 request was fracturing in plain sight. I took a slow sip of coffee, the steam fogging my glasses for a heartbeat. That small gesture, the warmth in my hands, the bitter taste on my tongue, felt like the purest symbol of freedom. I wasn't chained to their schedule anymore. I wasn't sacrificing doctor's appointments, birthdays, or sleep for leaders who mocked me behind closed doors. Instead, I sat in my own space, steady and unshaken, watching as their downfall played out in headlines too large for them to control. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had dismissed me as insignificant, a woman asking for $2 more an hour. And yet, it was that very detail, that annotation they overlooked, that dismantled their most ambitious project. My silence had become sharper than their speeches, my precision more powerful than their arrogance. Ethan's smile, once plastered across glossy magazines, was now a meme for hubris. Graham's voice, once commanding, had turned defensive, reduced to excuses about technical errors that no one believed. And through it all, my name remained where they had tried hardest to erase it, in the record. Unmovable, undeniable. I didn't need to stand on their grand stage or face the cameras. Liberation didn't require noise. It required only the quiet certainty that dignity had been restored. As the day stretched on, emails trickled in, former colleagues reaching out in hushed tones, strangers sharing their own stories of being dismissed, underestimated, silenced, reading their words. I realized this wasn't just my vindication. It belonged to every worker who had ever been told their details didn't matter. Every voice mocked for asking what was fair. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of release wash over me. 14 years of silence, humiliation, and sacrifice had led here, not to a crown, not to glory, but to something deeper, the simple, undeniable truth that I had never been invisible. And neither is anyone who has ever carried the invisible weight of a company on their back. So if you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever been told you were small for asking what you deserved, remember this: the smallest detail can topple the tallest empire. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're watching from. Hit like if this story resonated with you. And subscribe for more stories that remind us that no injustice goes unanswered.